on tonight's wonderful webinar. As a reminder tonight, as with all of our webinars, if you have any questions, just put your questions over in the chat box to your right. All questions will be fielded either as we go along or at the end of the presentation. I'm so excited that tonight we have two guests who are joining us from outside of Hillsborough County School District. Our first guest is Dr. Melissa Bailey of the Bailey Group. She has a comprehensive psychological group that assesses many areas, including autism and psychoeducation, as well as other conditions. And tonight she's going to be talking about helping to identify the problem and getting your children back on track if your child is struggling in school. And then also with us, we have Pamela Robinson with Aaron's House. Aaron's House is a nonprofit group that does advocacy work for caregivers of individuals with bipolar disorder, depression, and other mental illnesses. And they provide resources and educational care. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bailey, who will be our first speaker. Thank you, Dr. Bailey, for joining us, and you can get started.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. My name is Dr. Melissa Bailey. I have a practice called Bailey Psychology Group, and it's located in Safety Harbor, Florida. I also have a satellite office in Tampa, in the same office as a program called Autism Shifts. So I'm going to be talking tonight about how we can help identify problems that your child may be having in school. So first of all, a little bit about me. These are my two kids, Alex and Roxanne. Alex and Roxanne actually both have autism. Alex is higher functioning than Roxy. Alex is obviously, as you can see, to the left there, and then Roxanne has autism, but she's a little bit more severe. So I've actually been through my own journey with my children in terms of having them diagnosed. And actually Alex is 17 years old now, and Roxy is 14 years old. So I've kind of been through a lot of what some of the families who are going through the same thing have been through. So I've had my kids with IEPs and working with the schools, and as a result, I've also been able to assess other children and have a unique ability to know both sides, being the psychologist as the assessor and helper and as the parent. So some of the things we're going to learn about today include there's a number of different special education designations and that the school district will identify as a child who needs additional services. We're going to go over those today. We're going to talk about what a learning disability is specifically, what the difference between a 504 plan is and an IEP, and how do we get the school district to help us out, and what exactly is a psychoeducational evaluation. And then I always like to talk a little bit about our adult children or our kids who are transitioning from 18 into adulthood, because that's obviously something I'm dealing with right now. And I think especially those of us who have kids who maybe have more severe disabilities, we're always a little concerned about that. So here on this slide, I have a number of different special education categories and different types of disabilities that are identified by the school districts. Some of the ones that probably are more common that we see include speech and language disability or impairment. Some of these designations vary according to the school district. There's visually impaired. There's also an autism-like behaviors category. Other health impairment is another one we see frequently, and these are children who usually have fairly significant attention deficit hyperactivity disorder that interferes with their ability to access the curriculum. There's also intellectually disabled for those kids who have a diagnosis of an intellectual disability. We have developmentally delayed, and again, depending on the school district, developmentally delayed is usually identified for children who are much younger. Because sometimes, especially little kids, you know, until they've gotten services and have been in school, they don't always, they're not able to, you know, sit still at the table, or they're still developing, because developmental issues don't always move forward at the same rate. So we kind of have that designation to give other little kids kind of a leg up on their education, and then those kids are usually reassessed around kindergarten age to see if they actually fall into any of the other categories. Another one we see is emotionally disturbed. Those are kids who have a lot of emotional issues. I think in Florida they call it EBD here. Also, we have specific learning disabilities or learning disabilities, and also I see a number of kids who have multiple disabilities. So those are some of them in the categories. The specific ones are going to vary according to school district and state. I should mention that I've been doing this for quite a while. I've been a psychologist for over 25 years. I do work in both California, where I work with the school districts out there as an independent assessor and do psychoeducational evaluations there. I've also worked in Arizona and Nevada. So I'm fairly new to Florida, so I'm still, you know, learning all of the specific lingo, but these categories give you the idea of some of the things of the categories. Usually, in order to meet special education eligibility, because oftentimes parents want to know, how can my child get additional services if they think they need it? Usually you have to meet the requirement of one or more of the special education disability categories that I outlined before. Also, the issues need to adversely affect the child's performance. So, for example, today I just talked to a mother who has a 14-year-old son who has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and he was placed on medication when he was younger. The medication did exactly what we would like it to do. So he actually never required a 504 plan or an IEP plan in school because, you know, the medication did what it needed. Well, puberty hits, and now he's having a lot more difficulties. The medication isn't working as well. He's a teenager now. He doesn't want to take it. So now he's failing in school. So prior to this point, he would not have been eligible for anything because it wasn't really interrupting any issues with the curriculum. Also, we need to look at specifically if there's additional help that's going to be required for that child to get the services that they need. So one of the things I like to see here is that our education system, everybody is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. So one of the things I really like to focus on when I work with families is that every child has strengths. So the idea is that we want to make sure that children, we really highlight their strengths. Some kids are more visual learners. Some kids have more difficulty reading. So we want to make sure that everybody is accessing those strengths so that they can access and learn the best way that they can. So that's part of what some of the assessments are, and really trying to help with those children find out what those strengths are. So one of the things that will often come up is parents will ask, well, what specifically is a learning disability? So in terms of the some of the definitions is that there has to be some basic psychological processes that are problematic. So for example, you can have a specific learning disability related to attention problems, visual processing, auditory processing. Auditory processing is where you might notice if you ask a child a number of questions and they never really seem to get it, or they give you a totally random answer, that child may have some auditory processing issues. Many times the educational audiologist needs to check that out for the child. You can also have sensory motor problems and some cognitive issues. But it's got to be able to manifest in certain things like the child's ability to listen, to think, speak, read, write, or spell, and also related to math. So it has to impact them educationally somehow. So for example, I always like to joke that I have a real hard time understanding and remembering people's names. So as your therapist, if I call you Bob, nobody's really going to like that. So I really have to work on that. But just because I can't pull out that, because I have name apraxia, which would be the technical word, that doesn't really impact my ability to do a whole lot of things, so that wouldn't be considered a learning disability. Also, one of the other defining things about a learning disability is that there must be a severe discrepancy between the child's intellectual ability and their achievement in one of the following areas that's listed below. So, for example, we can have a child who comes out on an IQ test and they're all in the average range, but then when we give them academic testing, their reading level might come out several grades lower. So there's a big discrepancy there in terms of the child's ability versus what they're doing academically. So that's one of the reasons why some of the assessments are very important. Another one might be written expression. I recently had a little girl come into my office, and mom thought she had dyslexia, which isn't really a term that we use a whole lot, at least us psychologists. But sure enough, she walked in, very smart, bright girl. I asked her to write her name. She wrote the thing completely backwards. So I tried having her write a couple of other things. Everything was backwards. Or she wasn't even able to write the complete alphabet, but she was able to say it with no problem. So that's a good example of a large discrepancy. So some of the ways that we look specifically at how learning disabilities are determined is we have to use standardized tests. And the school district isn't necessarily going to identify a child without having the objective data. So that's one of the reasons why we have to do some assessments, and that's why sometimes the school district may ask to do a psychoeducational assessment on your child, especially if they're struggling. So you do kind of have to look at that. Also, many of the school districts in Florida use the response to intervention before they actually go forward and try and do that. So we can see if we can do some other types of interventions in the classroom before we actually roll out the whole 504 IEP plan. So many times, at least at the school district level, there's teachers, the special education staff. If there's a child who's identified as having issues, then they actually will try and do some things at their own level first before going to the full psychoeducational evaluation. So with the RTI, specific learning disabilities may be determined if, again, the child exhibits a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, Johnny is really great if I ask him the question orally, but if I have it written down and he's got to write it, he can't do it at all. So we need to look specifically in terms of how is the child functioning in these areas, and are there strengths and weaknesses, and also is it bad enough that their grades are down or they're not functioning at their age capacity. So just because a child has, B's doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be able to get additional help, because technically B's means, the child's doing pretty good. I know I've personally had some parents who, get very concerned about that. But, the reality is that does not necessarily meet the standards for special education. So one of the things we're going to talk about also is the 504 plan. The 504 plan was part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And what it looks at is that children who are considered disabled in a functional sense, so such as ADHD or Tourette's, things like that, where the child has some symptoms and it's, again, impacting them, but they need a little bit additional help. So the placement team, not an IEP team, will determine if it's necessary. And again, each of those standards and procedures for determining who gets a 504 plan, which is basically interventions specifically designed for your child to help them in the classroom, are identified by the various different districts. I know, having worked for a number of different districts, every one of them is a little bit different on how they determine whether or not they're going to have the 504 plan or not. So the 504 plan defined is a plan developed to ensure that a child who has a disability identified the law as attending an elementary or secondary educational institution receives accommodations that's going to help them succeed. So the 504 plan actually will often identify different types of interventions that are going to be used in the classroom. So this can be anywhere from preferred seating, it can be extra time on a test. For children who might have emotional issues, it might be being able to reach out to the school counselor. So the 504 team actually can sit down with the parent and try and figure out, well, what are some of the interventions that are going to help their child? So I know for my kids with having autism when they were younger, lots of times they might need a sensory break, which would mean, having either a stress ball that they could use, walk in the back of the classroom until they felt like they could return back to the classroom. The IEP, or the Individualized Education Plan, is a plan or program developed to ensure that the child who has a disability is identified and is also receiving specialized instruction or related services. Generally, a child who has an IEP usually, but not always, is going to have a little bit more intensity to the recommendations. There's also objective goals usually listed. So, for example, one of the IEP goals that I just saw today, reviewing some records, was that Johnny will respond to questions with 6 to 8 utterances. This was for a child who has a specific speech and language impairment and generally only answers with a one-word response. So the idea is to get him to speak more in full sentences that are more age appropriate for his age. So the idea is with the IEP, once we do that, then the IEP team can go back and review to see how that child is objectively meeting those specific objectives. In addition, the IEP will also add the ways in which the child or the school is going to help accomplish that. So the IEP as a parent, oftentimes I expect progress is one of the things that I know many parents like to see with when an IEP is implemented. So, for example, I know for myself when, my kids were younger, Roxy, who has autism, she does not have a lot of functional language. So one of the things that, they would put on her IEP would be something like, she's going to read a paragraph. And I would be like, that's a little unrealistic. I don't think that's actually going to happen. So sometimes, depending on the situation, sometimes I had to dial back my expectations for both what Roxy could do and the school. So the IEP is required by the IDEIA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. It was designed by the federal government to be able to process that children could get the services that they need, and that it could be identified in the psychoeducational evaluation. So not all students who have disabilities require specialized instruction, like I said before. So some students with disabilities do not necessarily require that. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act controls those procedural requirements, and then an IEP is developed. So the idea is that it requires more of a measurable type of growth. So for disabilities that don't require specialized instruction but need the assurance that will receive an equal access to public education services, a document is created to outline that. So for example, students with 504 plans do not necessarily need that specialized education. They may just need some accommodations in the classroom. So if you can see the difference, the 504 is usually an accommodation in the classroom, whereas the IEP can be anywhere from maybe certain pullouts in the classroom. I observed a classroom a couple of weeks ago where they actually had push-in services, where they had an aide who came to the classroom to help the child with a certain subject so that the child could still be with their class. Another specialized instruction might be speech therapy, occupational therapy, a special day class, a behavioral assist. So all of those different things would be under that highlight of additional specialized instruction, this might also go for a child who has an emotional disturbance, such as bipolar disorder or other acting out behaviors. That might include a special day class or even a special type of school. So in other words, a 504 is not necessarily a legal document. It says these are the accommodations I'd like for my child, but it doesn't necessarily mean that if you move across the country, the 504 plan is going to be strictly enforced by the new school. An IEP, however, is a legal document that has specific procedural requirements. If your child does have an IEP, you know that usually at the beginning of the IEP, the school has to read off some things about the procedural guidelines. Also, you have to be able to bring someone with you if you want someone to advocate with you. You can literally, as I did when we moved to Florida from Arizona, take the kids' IEPs and present it to their home school, and it will have to be honored. Of course, the school district may, however, want to conduct their own assessment of the child because it's, obviously a new child to them, to the district. An IEP is generally more enforceable than a 504 plan. So my kind of thing here is, as parents, well, it's in the IEP. So one of the things that was really interesting when I lived in Arizona, it's super hot there. It's a dry heat. So Roxy had major feeding issues. So she would only drink apple juice pretty much. She'd only drink apple juice or Pediasure. And if she didn't feel like eating that day, she wasn't going to eat. But one of the things that happens in Arizona is that we really want to make sure that, Roxy's hydrated, because that happens. Kids get super dehydrated if they don't drink. And so that was actually one of the things on our IEP, that she would be escorted. If she wasn't drinking, she would be escorted to the nurse's station where we kept a stash of things we knew she would drink. We would water down the apple juice, but at least we knew that she was actually, drinking something. So that was actually in her IEP, which I thought was great that they thought about that. So that's kind of an odd kind of accommodation, but it was very necessary for her overall health with that. So getting the help your child means, one of the things I always tell parents is everything must be in writing. One of the things, if you're going to request services or if you want additional help with your child, you need to put it in writing. Because one of the things, I like to tell this one story. When I was working in California with a family, I worked with a lot of monolingual Spanish families. And I had this woman who had been asking for help for her middle schooler for a whole year from the principal. So I met with the child, and he was obviously psychotic. It was one of those sad cases where you see childhood psychosis. And mom had been asking for help, and no one was helping her. So finally what I did is I had her put it in writing. I helped her get it to the assistant principal and contacted the special education district. And obviously the school was kind of brushing her off. Well, by the time we put it in writing and got the special education district level involved, they had called the principal or the assistant principal and said, we need an IEP, and you need to call me back in 2 hours and tell me when it's going to be. So the idea is that a parent can ask for things all day long till they're blue in the face of the school. If you don't put in a formal request, then it doesn't necessarily mean that the school is going to do anything. So it's very important to make sure that you put things in writing and you keep track of all your correspondences, who you spoke to, who you gave emails to, so that way you can keep a record of that if you are having a difficult time. Another example is that when my son Alex was younger, I wanted him to have additional speech. His initial IEP said that he was supposed to be getting group speech. Well, it wasn't really happening, so I got a speech evaluation. I asked for additional speech for it to be reviewed. I walked into the school with my letter for the assistant principal, and the secretary kind of held up her hands and went, oh, no, I'm not taking that. I said, well, what do you need? She goes, oh, the assistant principal isn't here. Well, what happens is as soon as she takes that, her timeline starts. So she wasn't going to take it without the assistant principal there. So I actually had to come back the next day to drop it off and, make a note for myself who took it. So everything should be in writing, and I usually recommend it actually being a letter. So let's talk about the role of the psychologist. So I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. So I'm in private practice, but I do contract with some districts. And then there's also the school psychologist, who is someone who is usually doing some of the assessments through the school district. And they're actually hired by they actually work for the district. So some of the things that I do is I actually do assessment, which means that I do a clinical interview, I do cognitive testing, which means IQ testing. I also do academic testing, I can do neuropsychological testing. I can also help with consultation and help consult the school and the parent about how I can better help their child. I also conduct psychoeducational evaluations. One of the things that I do in California is that I conduct independent ones, which means that the school district hires me as a non-biased person to kind of come in and look over everything and do assessments. In California specifically, some of the school districts are not allowed to do IQ testing, which lots of times will give you a lot of information. So I am, as an independent person, able to go in and give IQ testing. I know it's a little bit different here. I've seen Pinellas County schools, they do IQ testing as well. One of the other things that a psychologist can do is help with behavior therapies. Many times, for example, children who have attention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity problems, they sometimes need some behavioral interventions. A psychologist can help with that, as can someone, lots of times a school also will have a behavior interventionist. Parent education is a big part of what I do. Lots of times, just today I had a parent who came in who just moved here from New York, and she didn't really understand the whole process of the IEP, the 504, but now her son is having a lot of problems. So a lot of it is for me to help them understand this whole process of what happens with the school district, and really also what are some things that the school district can't do. I oftentimes see families think that, ask the school district for help when really it's not their jurisdiction to do things like, interpersonal therapy, individual therapy, family therapy. Those things are for outside agencies. And of course, one of the things I provide is support. I also do that through Erin's House, which Pamela Robinson will be talking about in a little bit. I do support groups for parents who have children who either have mental health issues, developmental disabilities, things like that, because lots of times as parents, such as myself, who have disabled kids, it can be a pretty lonely place. So support is a huge part of what is important. So assessment, as I mentioned, in order for you to get an IEP, you have to ask, you must have a reason to ask or have information. So you just can't go, I think Johnny needs help, and you really don't have anything, you have no data for that. So it's your information lots of times versus the school district. Lots of times if you ask for an assessment and the school thinks that there's, on their end, they've done the response to intervention, then what happens, they'll provide an assessment. The school district also has timelines, how long they can do the assessments or how many days it requires for them to do it. I know that some of the school districts have been short on school psychologists, so they have encouraged families to get outside assessments, but in general, the school district is supposed to provide those things. In general, if you disagree completely with the assessment that the school district did, you can request an independent education evaluation. I don't see that as much happening as I do out in California, but it's also something that you are able to ask. Some of the different tests that I utilize include achievement tests. Some of the ones that might be familiar to you if you see them on your children's psychoeducational evaluations that the school district does. Some of those include the Woodcock-Johnson, the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, the Wide Range Achievement Test, the Kaufman. All of those different ones look specifically at reading, writing, listening comprehension, spelling, essay writing, all those different things. IQ tests, lots of times the big daddy is the Wechsler scales, which includes the Wechsler the Wechsler Intelligence Scales for Children, 5th edition. Those are the ones that I use more of. We also have a Kaufman, and we have a Stanford Binet. One of the reasons why we're able to use so many different ones is because we really can assess the child with the same test within the same year. And some of them have different components. Like, for example, the new WISC-5 has a lot more nonverbal subtests than previously. There's a number of neuropsychological processing tests that we can use, such as the trail-making test, the test of auditory processing. We can look at visual motor index, motor coordination, things like that. I also have used tests of the Conners, something similar to the Conners that looks at specifically at auditory and visual processing. And then, of course, we have surveys, which include the behavior assessment system for children that usually both teachers and parents fill out. The Conners looks at attention and impulsivity, both the teachers and parents fill out. So there's a number of different ways that we can assess and get good data for what is going on with your child. Part of the psychoeducational report should also have recommendations about how to better help your child. This can include a wide range of things that include classroom placement, such as special day class, a pull-out to a special education room. Some of it can be a change of schools. Also, if additional assessments are needed. Some children, such as children who have autism, may do better with assisted technology. For example, one of the things that they used with my daughter when she was younger is that we used an iPad and we used an app that helped her to type out what she needed. Some of it might be for little guys using a visual calendar, a visual schedule during the day. Some of the other things might include therapies for children who might have an emotional disorder. When you have an IEP meeting, and I always recommend to parents that you bring somebody with you. And one of the reasons I say that is because I wasn't always a psychologist and as savvy at these things as I am now. When I'm at my kid's IEP meeting, I am still just a parent. So I have learned to be more assertive, but when they're talking about your child, it can get pretty emotional. So I usually recommend that if you're able to bring somebody with you who can take notes, because you're not going to remember everything that they say. So it's important that you have support there with you, because lots of times when you enter that room, it's going to be, you know, the vice principal, it's going to be a special education teacher, it's going to be a general education teacher. So sometimes it can be very overwhelming and intimidating when you're sitting at that table with all of these other school administrators. So it's nice to have somebody come with you, or at least have who has an understanding or who can take notes. The other thing I always recommend is make sure that you're keeping tabs on the school. So, you know, one of the things that I always advocate for parents is make sure you have a clear line of communication with the teachers, the behavior specialists, all of the people who are interacting with your child. And it's really important that you be an active participant in your child's education and all of the services. Because otherwise what happens is that you come to the IEP and then you're asking, well, how is he doing with this? And you're surprised by the outcome. I never want to be surprised about what's going on with my kids at school. I want to know exactly what's happening, if they're having a bad day. Usually if I know my kids are having a bad morning, I go ahead and let the school or the teacher know, hey, Alex had a bad morning this morning. I just wanted to let you know. So that way everybody is on the same page. For the most part, most teachers and administrators really appreciate it if you're involved with all of that. So this is my little joke about the IEP fantasy. I did have a fantasy like that several years ago when one of the speech therapists was trying to take away my daughter's speech, and she didn't get away with it, thankfully. I was assertive, but you know, I wasn't happy with them wanting to take away her speech when, you know, she doesn't have a lot of functional language already. So sometimes it can be very frustrating to be in these meetings, but it's also very important to keep your cool. So one of the other things I wanted to talk about briefly before we move on to Pamela Robinson is one of the things to think about is as your child, especially your more disabled child, becomes closer to 18, you do want to start thinking about what are we going to do afterwards. And this is something that a lot of parents I work with don't really think about because they don't want to think about it. My own child is turning 18 in October, and so believe me, I've been thinking about this quite a bit. For a child who has a greater disability, after 18, they may be eligible for extended school. So for example, my daughter Roxanne will most likely stay in extended school until she's 22 years of age. Now that's important to know if you do have a really disabled child because a lot of the adult services don't start until age 22. If you think you're going to apply for your child for Social Security disability, start keeping records so that way when you apply, it's very easy for you to have all of those records at hand because I can tell you that even though Social Security will have you sign releases to get all of those records, a lot of the doctor's offices are not going to give those up easily. And then what happens is that many adults get denied the first time. That's very common, and not to be discouraged, just assume that you're going to appeal. One of the other tips is that if you are applying for Social Security for your child, whether your child's underage and disabled or 18 over, usually you're going to get a letter that's going to have the caseworker's name on it with a phone number. I always encourage families to burn up that phone. They record all of those calls. So if you're trying to get disability for your child, if a doctor changes medication, you're calling that number. Hey, Alex's medication got changed. Hey, Alex's therapist wants to increase his therapy. Hey, he got in trouble at school. We're moving him to a new classroom. All of those things all of those messages are going to build up your case for Social Security. Also, after 18, a disabled child will be eligible for Medicaid. The Agency for Persons with Disability helps people who have developmental disabilities. Vocational rehabilitation, I have to say, is a diamond in the rough I found here in Florida. They are amazing. I've sent so many people to vocational rehabilitation. If you have a child who's 14 and older, they have what's called the STARS program, which doesn't matter if your child has a disability or not. What they're doing is trying to prepare these children for the transition that they're going to face. So oftentimes they have different types of programs during non-school time. So like, for example, the Arc of Tampa Bay is offering a program over spring break that helps these teenagers learn what it's like to enter the workforce, what an entry-level job is going to look like, how they should present themselves in the workplace, and also exploring other career options. For children who are a little older than that and do have a disability, vocational rehabilitation will actually pay for a complete psychological evaluation to determine if that child is eligible for services. And then, based on the recommendations of the psychologist, they will receive whatever they need to get them employment ready. So I have actually had families who have contacted me who have no insurance, or they have a disabled child who's an adult, has no insurance. I have them come in. I'm like, let's have you go to vocational rehabilitation, sign up. You can get a free evaluation. In addition, if I do the evaluation and I recommend therapy, they will pay for therapy as well. They will pay for a psychiatrist if they think it's going to get this person to work. So vocational rehabilitation is really a great resource for teenagers and above. One of the other places, in addition to Aaron's house, that I work with because of my interest in autism is Autism Shifts and the Artista Cafe. The Artista Cafe is the coffee shop inside the Mercedes-Benz dealership in Tampa. And all of the people who work there have high-functioning autism, and they have been trained by Artista Cafe. Autism Shifts is an employment-ready course that is now funded by vocational rehabilitation, that people who have autism, higher functioning, can go there. The first week they learn about self-regulation skills, relaxation skills, how to better tolerate things that annoy them. And then the second week is all about business etiquette. Then the next step is trying to find a job that specifically is suited to that person on the spectrum. In addition, also therapy, I think, of course, is always a good thing. For some of our more disabled kids or adults, we can look into other types of programs such as residential treatment, things like that. So some of the things that Bailey Psychology Group offers include psychoeducational testing, customized reports, advocacy, parent education and support, specialized tutoring, and therapy using cognitive behavioral techniques. So this is the information about me. My main office, like I said, is in Safety Harbor. I have a number of other therapists, master's level therapists who are working with me, including those who specialize in children. Like I said, I also go out to the schools. I also have an office at Keystone Prep in Odessa. I have an office in Hillsborough County. So that way, you know, I'm trying to make sure that we can kind of spread out to help a lot of the different families. One of the other things I like to say is I did have breast cancer in 2010, and I did write a book about it. I just like to throw that in there. But the big thing that I want to turn it over now to is to Pamela Robinson. Pamela Robinson is a wonderful woman, human being, who started Erin's House, and I'll let her tell a little bit about that. But we do provide support services, and now I'm really excited to report that we have a support group in Hillsborough County at the Graham House, and we also do a virtual support group one time a month, and now we also have the support group at my office in Safety Harbor. So I'll go ahead and let Pamela take it from there.
Good evening, and thank you so much, Dr. Bailey, for that wonderful and informative presentation. As Dr. Bailey said, my name is Pamela Robinson, and just a little about myself. I am a practicing attorney. I have been practicing law for 30 years, and I have 2 children, Erin and Donna, and I started Erin's House in 2015. My son Erin, and it was named obviously after my son Erin, who was bipolar. In 2014, I got the news that that any parent wants to dread, and that is that my son was hurt and he was in an accident. My son passed away at the age of 30 during a psychotic episode. Erin was diagnosed with bipolar disorder at the age of 18. So one of the ways that I dealt with my grief, in addition to seeking grief counseling, is to help others that are similarly situated. So the idea came to me that there are thousands, if not millions, of people who are going through the same thing as I did with my son and who are caregivers. So in 2015, I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Bailey. I talked with Dr. Bailey and I gave her my idea of what I wanted to do. And I also, I needed some feedback because the foundation is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. I'd never founded such an organization, nor been a part of an organization. So once I talked to Dr. Bailey and she was on board with my idea and she thought it was a great idea and she agreed to be the licensed clinical psychologist that facilitates the support groups. Now, what we do is at Erin's House is we give support to caregivers, parents, and support persons of those diagnosed with mental illnesses. The way we give support, number one, is compassion. It's nothing in the world like talking to somebody that really, really understands what you're going through. Oftentimes as a caregiver, your day is just stressful and it's really hard and basically your mind is going 24 hours a day when you're a caregiver trying to overcome trying to get in front of what's going to come to you. So as caregivers during our support groups, we give caregivers compassion. We let them know that they are not alone. We let them know how to navigate themselves, how to navigate through the system. And as Dr. Bailey touched on, we have several support groups. And she told you about the different support groups that we have. Now, 4 times a month, caregivers can connect with us. The support group One of the support groups is held at Grace Point. And like Dr. Bailey said, another one is held at Bailey's Psychology Group at Dr. Bailey's office. We have a virtual support group. Oftentimes it's inconvenient to meet at a designated area. So what we do is that we have a conversation where up to 25 people can get on a phone call, and we have a therapist, one of Dr. Bailey, trained by Dr. Bailey, that listens to the people, listens to caregivers, and offers them support. The fourth way that we have contact with support, with caregivers during the month is we have a 24-hour private Facebook group. And in that group, at any time of the day, if a caregiver is having an issue or a situation with their loved one that's struggling, that person can get on inside the private group and explain what is going on, and 9 times out of 10, somebody's going to respond to it immediately or during the day. And we started that in January, and it is really, really helpful, and we're really proud of that. Another way that we support caregivers is that through education. We have seminars. We have seminars on various subjects, such as what to do in case your loved one is having a crisis and law enforcement is called. We teach them what to do, how to talk to the officer, and how to prepare for that day if it ever comes. We give them education about different medications, housing, Social Security, any issue that would come up that a person dealing with a mental health issue would have. Those are the issues that we tackle with our caregivers. We also teach the caregivers self-love. We're not only about teaching and showing compassion, but what we do is we show them how to love themselves and how to have fun. Oftentimes we take them on outings, for instance, to a comedy show. Sometimes we give them vouchers for mani and pedicures. Our latest venture with the caregivers was in November when we had a party bus, and we took them shopping at a boutique, followed by followed by dinner. And when I tell you that those caregivers really, really enjoyed themselves, it was so refreshing to see them outside of a support group, to really see them let their hair down, to really see them dance and enjoy each other. Another way that we support, one of the things that we have coming up that I'm going to invite each and every one of you is that we're having a movie night at Grace Point March 26th. And what the movie night is that we're going to view a 30-minute movie, and Anne Hathaway is portraying a lady that has bipolar. But what that movie does is it gets the audience, it kind of shows the audience what it's like to suffer with a mental illness. And the beauty of the movie night is that we are encouraging teens, tweens, and adults to participate. We'll have food, raffles, popcorn, but the main thing about the movie night is that we will have Dr. Makita Wills, that is a psychiatrist. After the movie is shown, she will have a discussion about the movie and encourage each and every one, especially teens and tweens, to talk about the movie, maybe talk about any issue that they're having, because one of the things that we encourage is conversation. It's so very important to have a conversation about mental illness, because once you have that conversation, then you can have an idea of where the teen or tween is coming from, and then you can help. So in order to participate at movie night, you must RSVP to 813-341-3079. Now, Dr. Bailey has given us a plethora of information, and so I'm not going to belabor, what we do, but what I would encourage you to do is to visit our website, visit Erin's House website, which is www.untitled Aarons, AARONS house.org. And on our website, you can see what we do, who we service, and the many activities that we have been involved in since 2015. So we thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you all.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey and Ms. Pamela Robinson, for that awesome presentation and a great wealth of information. If anyone on the webinar has any questions, you may go ahead and ask now. All right, so thank you all for being on. Thank you, Shelley, for joining in. And Dr. Bailey, thank you so much for that information. Parents really don't have the outside help to help them navigate through our district. And sometimes there are challenges, and I'm glad you expressed everything that you said today, because our group is all about empowerment and family information that's going to help them advocate for their children and be there for that support. So thank you again. And with that, I'm going to close it out, and I would like for everyone to have a blessed evening. Good night.